Today we're going to be delving into the case known as the Boys on the Tracks Conspiracy. Picture this, it's August 1987 in a remote part of Saline County, Arkansas, when tragedy suddenly strikes. 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Dawn Henry unfortunately meet a horrifying end as they are hit by a train. However, where things get chilling is when the medical examiners would later reveal that the boys were not victims of a simple accident, but rather the implications that they were murdered quickly became more and more undeniable. And things get even stranger still, as it seems someone deliberately placed them on the tracks in order to make it look like an accident, along with a series of unexplained deaths that would quickly follow this case. What follows is a tangled web of murder, cover-ups, and conspiracy theories, involving not just the local police, but the FBI, the CIA, and even rumors, whose validity is questionable, of the involvement of a US president. Fast forward a few decades, and this case is still making headlines. New revelations continue to emerge in this case, keeping the mystery alive and hope for justice ever present. Today we'll be delving into the heart of this case, exploring the many leads and theories that tie this mystery together in an attempt to piece together what really happened on that fateful night in the Arkansas wilderness. Let's rewind things back a little bit to August 23rd, 1987 at around 4 a.m. as a train crew spotted some human forms on the tracks, which was rather alarming, leading them to blare their horns and try to make as much noise as possible in order to alert them, since stopping a train going around 55 miles an hour would take about a mile or more to come to a complete stop. Now, as they were blaring their horns and hit the brakes in an attempt to give the people on the tracks even a modicum of a chance to survive, it didn't seem to help at all, as the train collided with the objects on the tracks, then continued its journey for several hundred feet before coming to a complete stop. Now here is where things start to get a little eerie, because according to some reporting, all of the crew members aboard the train noted that those figures lying on the tracks motionless appeared as almost if they were sleeping, oblivious to the impending danger. Despite the deafening roar of the train, they didn't budge, they didn't move, they remained still. At first, the crew believed that this might have been an attempt at self-termination by placing themselves in harm's way. However, this suspicion quickly began to wane as the train operators started to notice something rather peculiar. In part, this was due to their experience with the train hitting things such as wild animals, the aftermath of which, while grisly, should have shared some similarities. And strangely enough, it seemed that the fragments and the conditions of the blood and the viscera did not match something that would have been freshly killed by the train itself, but rather something that had been lying on the tracks for a while. Now, why would this detail matter? Well, it would potentially point to a sinister conspiracy, someone potentially having been someone other than the two individuals who were struck by the train had been dead prior to their high-speed evisceration, meaning someone could have been attempting to use the train to cover up any evidence of their wrongdoing. Once the train crew alerted officials, it would take them just under an hour to arrive and begin their investigation. Initially, authorities themselves also believed it was a self-termination. However, unlike the crew, the authorities would state that they saw no tarp. Yet they did recover a .22 caliber rifle, which they quickly labeled as evidence. It would appear that the police's investigation was lackadaisical at best from the start, and potentially intentionally incompetent, since countless pieces of evidence, which multiple eyewitnesses had reported seeing, went uncollected, including, rather insultingly, one of Kevin Ives' feet, which there seems to be two different reportings on how it was located. One states the police would come back for it, and another would state that the family members had found the foot and would go on to call police to give them the foot. The police's insistence on this being a self-termination would become even more suspicious as EMTs on the scene would claim that the blood and the conditions of the bodies, what remained of them anyway, suggested that the victims had long been dead once they were struck by the train. However, the police decided to omit their statements from the reports. Eventually, the boys would be taken to a local medical examiner for identification, particularly through the use of dental records. This would allow them to be identified as 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry, and their tragic fate would quickly become the center of a long-standing mystery that continues to haunt investigators to this day. As the investigation into their deaths unfolded, the inclusion of Fahmy Malak, who would eventually pass in 2018, would complicate things greatly. He was a high-profile medical examiner who would eventually be known for his controversial calls, and this would mark a significant turning point in the strangeness of this case, seeing as even though there would be a more comprehensive examination of the evidence, it was done by someone who did not have the best track record. Malak's reputation preceded him. His arrival would stir both anticipation and anxiety amongst the community. With his expertise, or supposed expertise, the hope was that he would provide answers to the grieving families who desperately sought closure. However, as Malak began his examination, it appeared that more questions would surface than answers. His findings were almost exclusively met with skepticism and controversy. Many questioned the validity of his conclusions, while others suspected him of being a key part of political interference. Despite the uncertainty surrounding Malak's investigation, one thing would remain clear. The families of Kevin and Don were unwavering in their quest for justice. As things went on, the community grappled with a lingering uncertainty and fear. For the mysterious circumstances surrounding the boys' deaths cast a prominent shadow over Saline County, which left residents wary and distrustful of authorities. As the investigation dragged on, rumors and conspiracy theories swirled further and further still, complicating things and potentially hindering the pursuit of truth and justice. The case of the boys on the tracks became emblematic of the deep-rooted issues and tensions within the community. It seems the involvement of Fahmy Malak, the medical examiner, became even more shocking when he reportedly stated that the boy's death was at least in part due to excessive marijuana consumption. According to the report, the boys had allegedly smoked an estimated 20 marijuana cigarettes, rendering them so intoxicated that they were incapable of hearing or moving away from the oncoming train. Many have called this a rather absurd claim, in part due to even if Kevin and Don had indulged in a marathon smoking session, it seems implausible to suggest that they would be so incapacitated as to lie down on train tracks while an obvious blaring horn of the approaching locomotive did not rouse them in any way, all the while claiming that they somehow actually made it onto the train tracks, since on the tracks themselves there was no evidence of these marijuana cigarettes. What was more alarming was Malak's track record of questionable medical examinations. Since this wasn't the first time his conclusions raised eyebrows, in one instance, he mistakenly accused a doctor of causing a patient's death due to his inability to interpret the patient's chart accurately. In another brazen case, he ruled a death by multiple gunshot wounds to the chest as self-termination, and it seems most everyone would agree that that ruling defied all reason and evidence. How did Malak get away with consistently making such outlandish claims? This is a question that many have asked. However, the truth seems to be significantly more simple. Malak's questionable practices just went unchecked for far too long, which led to the doubts regarding the deaths of Kevin and Don. This underscored the need for an impartial investigation into the circumstances surrounding the night on the tracks, one disconnected from Fahmy Malak. Following the shocking revelations in Malak's autopsy report, the families of Kevin and Don were left deeply unsettled and discontent with Malak's conclusions, and they sought a second opinion from disconnected and independent medical examiners. And from here, the results seem to be rather damning. Dr. Joseph Burton, the primary medical examiner who was called in for a re-evaluation, was unequivocal in his assessment. Contrary to Malak's claims of excessive marijuana consumption, Dr. Burton only found trace amounts of THC in the boys' systems, which were noted not to be high enough to incapacitate them in any way, shape, or form. But it was not just the absence of THC which raised eyebrows. Burton's examination uncovered disturbing evidence which strongly contradicted Malak's findings. In particular, he echoed that the coagulated blood and intact heads along with torsos of the boys did not align with the typical injuries sustained by individuals slain by being struck by a train. The second autopsy would reveal that one of the boys' skulls had been crushed while the other had been stabbed several times in the back, and it was concluded that they were most likely dead when they were placed on the tracks, which matches what the train crew stated, and it was surmised that the crushing of the skull was likely caused by a blunt object, such as the butt of a rifle, which led to the reevaluation of the .22 caliber rifle that was found in the scene of the crime. This shocking revelation sent ripples throughout the community, and more importantly, with the boys' families. This was a major turning point which exposed the depths of the deception and cover-ups apparently taking place, leading to the families to continue tirelessly seeking justice for decades. However, at every turn, they were met with a web of lies, corruptions, and conspiracy, which seemed to seek to cloud the truth of what really happened on that tragic night on the tracks, which originally only involved the tragic end of Kevin Ives and Don Henry's lives, which was a harrowing ordeal for their parents. However, as investigators and the families delved deeper into the surrounding incident, it became clearly evident that there was significantly more to this case than a simple accident. And as suspicion began to mount, the focus of many was shifted towards Fahmy Malak, the medical examiner, whose findings had ignited controversy. It seemed he was not actually incompetent, but rather part of a grander conspiracy. The parents became determined to hold Malak accountable for what they perceived to be a cover-up of their children's murders. The second medical examiner, which was consulted, echoed their concerns. He would reveal that Malak's handling of the boys' bodies had been so destructive that it hindered any further investigation into their deaths. This would eventually lead to a grand jury being convened, who actively reclassified the case from an accidental death to a probable homicide. And it would be Judge John Cole who would assign attorney Dan Harmon as a special prosecutor to this case, assisted by attorney Richard Garrett. It must be noted that when confronted with the damning accusations by the second medical examiner, Malak remained defiant, insisting that his conclusions were accurate and any assessment he had made were beyond a shadow of a doubt. His dismissive responses about Don's stab wounds fueled further suspicions, as it seemed Malak was unwilling to acknowledge any wrongdoing or address the glaring inconsistencies within the report. In the aftermath of this, it seemed Malak's only response to criticism was to attribute it all to racism over his Egyptian heritage, which only seemed to further enrage the community, along with the families of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, particularly Kevin's mother, Linda Ives. This would lead into her engaging in a public campaign to expose what she believed was a massive cover-up orchestrated by local authorities, and her efforts would eventually catch the attention of Dan Harmon, the attorney who had been assigned as a special prosecutor to the case, leading to the investigation gaining substantial momentum, as Harmon and local law enforcement would embark on a quest to uncover any witnesses and gather crucial testimonies now that it had become a crime rather than an accident. Despite them being removed from the location of the incident proper, authorities would quickly find several witnesses willing to come forward and testify or give information. As Harmon's investigation would end up proving fruitless, the families would continue to call for witnesses, culminating in an October 1988 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. As the investigation would then progress, further developments began to unfold. Amongst them was the emergence of another young individual by the name of Keith Coney. His involvement in this case would prove significant, to say the least, setting the stage for a series of revelations which would challenge the official narrative and bring a glimpse of truth closer to the surface. As time passed, since the tragic death of Kevin and Henry, and with the emergence of Keith Coney, the investigation was severely shaken up now, as Keith came forward with his account of the events preceding the boys' deaths. However, coincidentally enough, just days after his initial testimony, tragedy would strike again, as Keith was involved in what many call a rather suspicious motorcycle accident, which was quickly officially labeled as a routine crash. However, witnesses claimed he was actively forced off the road by an unidentified and unmarked vehicle. Some even alleged that they had seen that his throat had been slashed. However, the validity of these statements has been called into question by multiple individuals. Yet the suspicious circumstances surrounding Keith's death only deepened the sense of unease surrounding this case. However, another witness would eventually step forward, despite the risks, by the name of McCaskill, and he would step forward just a few months after this tragic death. He would go on to recount his own version of events on that fateful night. However, his demeanor would take a notable turn shortly after speaking with police, as he began to exhibit clear signs of paranoia and a sense of impending death. In particular, he began to give away his possessions and bid farewell to his loved ones, going so far as to even plan out his own funeral, or so some claims have been made. Tragically, his fears would prove justified, as in November 1988 he was discovered brutally murdered in his garage. Reportedly, he was stabbed a myriad of times. Quickly after this, an investigation into the deaths of the witnesses would unfold, and from this investigation a chilling pattern emerged. Each incident seemed more eerie than the last. McCaskill's neighbors would come forward with a shocking account, claiming to have witnessed multiple masked men entering McCaskill's garage, who proceeded to brutally murder him. However, just 3 months later, said neighbor would be charged with McCaskill's death. Now, it's really important to note that the tragedies would not stop there. 3 months later, another witness, Greg Collins, was discovered dead in the depths of the woods with a single gunshot wound to his head, execution style, sealing his fate. Following shortly thereafter, yet another witness vanished without a trace. Not even their family knew where they were. And the cycle of tragedy seemed to continue unabated, as Jeff Rhodes, another individual connected with this case, mysteriously disappeared, only for his lifeless body to be found later, burned in a dumpster in April 1989, his body seemingly suffering severe mutilation. One of the final individuals who was slain, and the sixth official witness, was James Millen, who met a similarly gruesome fate. He had been found in his home, decapitated, his head nowhere to be found, leading to an ironic situation which raised eyebrows and further fueled the suspicions of a cover-up to all those who are familiar with this case. The medical examiner who was tasked with investigating Millen's death was none other than Fahmy Malak himself. In a baffling twist, it seemed Malak would conclude that Millen died of a stomach ulcer and that his head had been consumed by his own dog. The case would officially remain as death via natural causes. This was even stranger and more suspicious, since it seems multiple sources claimed that there were severe slash marks upon the body, clearly depicting that it was done with a bladed tool or implement. And things became even stranger still when the head would turn up in a garbage can, severely decomposed but still in one piece, meaning the dog had not eaten anything. And the last death involving the witnesses was Jordan Kettleson, who was said to have held information on the deaths, and he was found shot to death in the front seat of his pickup in June 1990, meaning that in 1 year, 6 witnesses had died under mysterious circumstances. But there was also Richard Winters, a suspect in the deaths of Ives and Henry, who was killed in a robbery in July 1989, and subsequently it was proved to be a setup, essentially eliminating almost all leads within a year. This means there are at least 6 deaths tied to this cover-up, or supposed cover-up. But adding to the intrigue, during this time, a grand jury would be convened to review the evidence. However, for one reason or another, rather than pursuing justice to the end, the case seemed to be dropped. And many believe this is tied to Dan Harmon, as many members of the jury expressed their discomfort with this decision and believed that the information they had seen should be made. But the plot thickens further still, as we focus on one Jean Duffy. On her first day on the job, her superior seemed to approach her with something significant. which brought her into the case. This would be rather unusual due to, other than the claim of the marijuana cigarettes, which quickly fell through, there was nothing that realistically should have tied the drug task force to what appeared to be a series of murders. However, it seemed that Jean would continue to pursue this investigation. Yet every time she had brought up the possibility of the boys having been actively murdered or a cover-up connected to the local drug rings, the higher-ups brushed her off, and reports go that they dismissed all of her theories as some crazy conspiracy theory. Yet, if the police department believed that she was legitimately not sound of mind and coming up with conspiracy theories, why would they not officially reprimand or transfer her? Eventually, she would hit a breakthrough with a peculiar witness, and once Dan Harmon got wind of this, it seemed he lost it. He went to the press in order to run a smear campaign and eventually got Jane Duffy ran out of the district. After Jean got booted and key witnesses dead, the case was, for all intents and purposes, permanently closed. However, the families weren't having that, and I mean, can you blame them? But thanks to Linda Ives' persistent complaints and her dogged determination, in 1993, the case was reopened. And that's when Detective John Brown would step in. However, he would go on to claim that on his first day on the case, his superior would go on to put him in a patrol car and just started driving him around, while actively discouraging Brown from looking into the case at all, further pointing to a massive cover-up, in particular involving the drug task force. And honestly, as crazy as it sounds, crazy, right? Basically, he was handed a case and told not to bother with this one, just to relax and get paid while doing nothing. And eventually, they straight up ordered him to drop it. But eventually, Brown would stumble upon the same witnesses that Duffy had found 5 years prior. But as soon as he caught wind of it, Dan Harmon came swooping in, all bluster and threatening Brown, along with the other cops who seemed amicable to his investigative desires, that they would either back off or face ruination. However, rather than making Brown back off, this got him more curious, as he went on to investigate things more on his own. As Brown took over the investigation, he would find that multiple files had just vanished from police records, yet other records clearly stated that they existed. Multiple pages of what was found was blacked out in a way that honestly sounds like the CIA or another clandestine alphabet agency, and apparently his involvement in this seemed to have lit under the prosecutor Harmon. But as things turn out, the witness who had caused such a hubbub and had driven the prosecutor up the wall was named Charlene Wilson, who was at the time serving a sentence for a charge involving cocaine, which she strongly insisted was planted on her, which would follow in the conspiracy theory, especially since she had admitted to past drug use and not refuted it in other instances. But for some reason, this time, she claimed it was not hers. She would go on to claim that she was there on the tracks on August 23rd, 1987, and supposedly that she had a story that prosecutor Dan Harmon really didn't want becoming common knowledge. She and 4 others on that night were cruising along the tracks looking for her drug stash, and in essence, they would cross paths with 2 young hunters. And in this story, it seems that the group of 5 slew the 2 boys and moved their bodies to where they were found on the tracks in order to hide the evidence. And the ringleader of this group, at least in this story, was none other than Dan Harmon himself. If true, this would be an incredibly wide-sweeping conspiracy, which included the prosecutor, who would have had to blatantly have lied to the families of these young boys, to their faces, mind you, that he was seeking justice, all the while being the killer. Now, the validity of this story can't be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, in part due to the witness who supposedly exposed this having been sent to jail, and potentially the story being a way to shift blame and potentially get out of imprisonment via blaming the prosecutor. On the other hand, if it were true, it's a rather ingenious way to cover up your crimes, since it would be much too suspicious if yet another individual, who the police were investigating and you were known to have actively dissuaded them from doing so, was slain. Having them in jail would essentially scare people off and remove a large amount of validity in anything she said. No wonder it appeared that Dan Harmon was so dead set on keeping this information from being known. Apparently, this information had already been relayed to the FBI, yet for some reason, even with this game-changing information, the FBI had just shelved the case, ignored it, almost as if it didn't happen. So when John Brown stumbled upon this information, he knew that he would need more than just Charlene's word to crack the case. He needed corroboration, and he supposedly found it in one Tom Newhouse. According to Tom, on the night of the murders, there was another group of kids, unrelated to the tragedy, venturing out into the woods, in search of a supposed massive marijuana stash on the train tracks. Claims have been made that at the time of the incident, Tom would have been 12 years old. And why would they be in the woods looking for a drug stash or a drug drop? This was the era of the cocaine cowboys, so potential stashes of drugs in the woods makes as much sense as anything else a kid would go into the woods for. Now, at the time that he was interacting with Tom, the information that Charlene had given was not publicly accessible, meaning there was no way that the 12-year-old, now 17, could have known that Harmon was a part of the story. But as he came forward and spilled his side of the story, which confirmed much of what Charlene had said, it seemed this long dormant case had burst out of dormancy. Eventually, this would lead to Tom undergoing a polygraph test. And while the validity of polygraph tests is not the most trusted, it helps back up his story. He would go on to state that as his friends were playing along the railroad tracks and looking for the drug stash, they saw flashlights walking in the distance, which led them to becoming curious and wanting to know who they were. And as they walked by, it would seem that Tom identified the person leading the group, which backs up Charlene's story. He saw Dan Harmon, the prosecutor, and he recognized him not because he was a prosecutor, but because his mom had previously dated the man, and he found it rather odd that his mom's boyfriend would be on the tracks at that time. And then, out of the darkness, two boys would emerge from the woods, clutching their own flashlight, and quickly Dan's group grew tense. Suddenly, Tom states that he heard a gunshot, leading to this group noting that the two boys ran off, as a group of 5, led by Dan, chased after them. Worried that they themselves would get in trouble or were in danger, they quickly ran away. However, there was more information found. It appears that witnesses claim that Dan Harmon's group would eventually catch the two running boys and brutally beat them, then proceeded to place them on the tracks to get rid of any evidence, in the hopes that the train itself would eliminate any trace of their involvement in the case. Here's where things get even more sinister. As the families were seeking justice, Dan Harmon and the authorities had seemingly swooped in, feigning concern for the grieving families, while in reality they were more interested in sweeping the whole case under the rug as fast as possible. And this idea had credence lended to it by how quickly the case got shut down, and witnesses kept dying. But why would a supposed marijuana stash lead to something so extreme? And why would the medical examiner be so complicit in this cover-up? These questions hint to a larger conspiracy. In particular, one linked to the cocaine cowboys and an individual by the name of Barry Seal, who was part of a large drug ring where he, much like the cocaine cowboys, would drop off shipments of drugs in remote areas. In particular, he was supposed to drop off supplies at a constant rate in Mena, Arkansas. And the reason he supposedly chose Arkansas for this was because state officials had their own fingers in the pie, and supposedly were turning a blind eye to the operations. However, even after his 1986 death, these operations would continue due to how profitable it was. What would happen is the pilots would fly low with their lights off just above the tree line in order to avoid detection, as they just dropped off their cargo. And who was supposedly there to pick up the pieces and turn a profit? Well, in this instance, it would be none other than the local officials, and in particular, individuals higher up in the Arkansas government. Now, the strange amount of flexibility and obedience which Dan Harmon was able to acquiesce from the police seems to make more sense, and why he would be out in the woods at such odd hours, accompanied by a cadre supposedly willing to murder. It can be assumed that this group were involved in the movement of these illegal goods, potentially even being connected to one of the alphabet agencies. I know this might sound like it comes off as a convoluted conspiracy. However, in 1996, Dan Harmon would be convicted of smuggling drugs into the United States, connecting him to supposedly some corrupt officials who facilitated these illegal operations. However, Harmon's run-ins with the law would continue. In 2010, he would be arrested once again. This time, drug trafficking was the charge. and at that point it had been made abundantly clear that he had been deeply entrenched in criminal activities dating to the time that the boys had been slain. However, there are claims that Harmon wasn't acting alone. One, Richard Garrett supposedly played a pivotal role in aiding in Harmon's efforts to obstruct justice. Together, they supposedly manipulated information and evidence in order to cover up leads in the investigation. It seemed the people who had their calls intercepted by Garrett would claim that they would receive death threats via anonymous people over the phone, stating that they would kill them if anything about the boys in the tracks had been made known. And supposedly, Richard Garrett is claimed to be the culprit in the death of Keith McCaskill, due to supposedly having approached him prior to his demise. There were also claims of the involvement of other police officers, in particular Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell, who according to multiple witnesses were very much involved in the murder of the boys. Witnesses would go so far as to identify Lane as an individual who physically threatened those who dared speak against the official narrative. One witness even claimed that Lane retaliated by peppering his house with a series of shots in the cover of darkness. Now it seemed that Campbell and Lane were more than just officers of the law, but enforcers in a larger conspiracy, and potentially even hitmen. However, regardless of this information or the suspicion surrounding this case, they would remain police officers, their lives suffering little change, and they even went so far as to take legal action against the TV show Obstruction of Justice, who had identified them as prime suspects in the boys' murders. However, the court would rule against them, going on to affirm the status as potential and/or primary suspects in this case. Remarkably, this is not where the case of the boys on the tracks conspiracy ends. There are further twists and turns, as it seems authorities had opened and closed the case on 9 separate occasions. During one of the earliest and most earnest attempts to uncover the truth, the sheriff had set an investigator to delve into the matter. However, their efforts would be cut short when both the sheriff and investigator were arrested on charges of trafficking. And then there's the involvement of Richard Garrett, who early on, little to nothing could be found on him, but eventually, a new homeowner would purchase his residence, leading to them finding a drug lab hidden behind a false wall, or so some claim. And the claims get wilder still, as when the homeowner supposedly alerted the authorities to this illicit discovery, a police officer arrived on scene and urged him to dispose of all evidence immediately, even going so far as to offer aid in transporting this to the dump. As it turns out, multiple of the 3-letter agencies would eventually launch their own investigations into this case, in particular due to rumors and information of corruption. The FBI seemed to be the agency to most clearly document these findings, which strongly point to local law enforcement being involved in the deaths of the 2 boys. In particular, the federal agencies found that the public officials were at least tied to, if not outright guilty, of having witnesses arrested for supposedly unrelated drug charges. And apparently there was also a letter which named those involved that was seemingly dismissed as gibberish, garbage even, but supposedly held ties to everybody involved. Now, why would the authorities dismiss this wealth of information? And why would investigations now not restart on the death of the 6 individuals who were slain and were tied to the case? Even though this information exists, there are claims that the government would and will not do anything with them. Now, there are those who suspect that it might be the names of the individuals, or one in particular, who are still actively involved or connected in the government, despite more than 3 decades having preceded this case. In particular, many point to the individual whom had a hand in assigning Dr. Malik, and who had also given him his position. This individual was the governor of Arkansas at the time, who would eventually become the president of these United States, one Bill Clinton, and it is the assumption of many that at the time, the Clintons were in fact the individuals actually running the smuggling operation, along with being tied to running weapons to the Little Rock gangs at the height of the gang wars. Unfortunately, it appears that everyone involved in this case has reached a near dead end, struggling to make any further headway into the investigation. And as baffling as it is to think about a case with this much information, having large swaths of it restricted, redacted, or lost in some cases, leading to it becoming a true cold case that likely will never be solved, it seems to be the truth. In conclusion, in the journey through the intricate layers of this case, we are left to reflect on a mystery that is yet to be unraveled. And it is clear that there are those who still strongly believe that the pursuit of justice in this case must persist, as all we can really do at this point is hope collective efforts may lead to a future where transparency on this case prevails and closure can finally come to the boys on the tracks tragedy. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.